Use a 5mm Allen key to loosen the two bolts under the bottom bracket. Loosen the belt with a pin spanner and remove the belt from the sprockets. On Cowboy 2, you can remove the belt by pushing it off the front sprocket while turning the pedals slowly. Unplug the torque cable and the motor cable. Remove the rear wheel nuts and spacers with an 18mm wrench. Remove the rear mudguard from the axle and free the wheel from the bike. On Cowboy 2, remove the mudguards and set them aside. Remove the outer nut. If needed, use an 18mm wrench and hold the axle in place with a 10mm wrench. Carefully cut the plastic sleeve open without damaging the cable inside, then remove the spacer. Store the cable into the axle, then remove the inner nut with an 18mm Allen key, holding the axle with a 10mm Allen key. Then carefully remove the small rubber O-ring. Early Cowboy 2s had a different freewheel mounting system. To remove it, store the cable into the axle and remove the screw with a 2.5mm Allen key. Then remove the lock nut by holding the axle with a 10mm open-end wrench and unscrewing the lock nut with a flat screwdriver. If you are replacing the torque sensor or the sprocket, loosen the lock ring with the specific tool, using it in the correct orientation. If you are replacing another component, you can skip this step. Pull the rear sprocket and torque sensor out of the bike. If it is difficult to remove, use a wrench to generate extra torque. If the part is very difficult to remove, you can use a hammer on an open-end wrench to get the parts out. Make sure to protect the rest of the wheel with a cloth to avoid any damage. Loosen the 6 screws with a Torx 20 key. Make sure you push firmly when trying to remove these screws to avoid damaging them. Then remove the motor cover. If the part is difficult to remove, you can use a hammer on the axle while holding the motor cover in your hand. Grab the torque cable and pull the motor out. In case it is hard to remove, you can use a hammer to tap gently on the non-drive side until you are able to pull the motor out. Then hold the axle with a 10mm wrench and use a Phillips head screwdriver to carefully detach the torque cable from the motor. Push firmly on each screw to avoid stripping their head. On the new motor, mount and attach the torque cable in the correct orientation. Best to mount all 3 screws while keeping them loose, then tighten them all at the end. The cables on each side of the motor should point in the same direction. Make sure the spacer on the non-drive side is well positioned, then mount the new motor on the wheel. Mind the rubber seal on the non-drive side, it should be well rounded. Make sure the motor gets inserted all the way in. Use a Phillips screwdriver to loosen the 3 screws holding the torque cable. Make sure to push down firmly to avoid damaging these screws. Reinstall the torque cable and attach the screws. Make sure you orient the axle correctly. The cables on each side of the wheel should point towards the same direction. If needed, push the inside of the motor back into its original position. Then reinstall the motor cover and tighten the 6 screws in a star pattern with a Torx 20 key. Make sure you don't over-tighten these screws, especially if you use a drill. Remove the motor cover rubber seal, then add some bearing grease on the bearing. Put the seal back in position. On the torque sensor, if needed, break the magnetic ring and remove it, as well as the metal holder. Carefully separate the torque sensor electronics from their housing. Fit the torque sensor electronics on the axle after carefully aligning the white pin. Then fit the spacer on the axle. Add the O-ring to the outside of the freewheel, then apply grease on its basis without getting any inside. Then fit the freewheel on the wheel. Fit the inner spacer on the wheel, then the sprocket in the correct orientation, and finally the outer spacer. Apply grease on the outside of the freewheel, then fit the bearing shield on the wheel. After adding grease to it, mount the lock ring and tighten it firmly. Install the small rubber O-ring. Then install the inner nut of the freewheel kit. The ledge on the nut should go towards the inside of the wheel. Use a torque wrench to tighten it to the specified torque. Then add the tear-shaped spacer in the correct orientation. There are two versions of the spacer. The long, wider version is mounted in the opposite direction than the freewheel rotation, so clockwise. The shorter, narrower version is mounted in the same direction as the freewheel rotation, so counterclockwise. Then guide the torque cable through the opening in the spacer. Add the sleeve over the spacer. Then add the remaining outer nut. And tighten it to the correct torque. Use a heat source, such as a lighter, to heat shrink the sleeve. First install the Poka-yoke washer on the non-drive side, pointing it towards the outside. Put the wheel back into position. Then install the washers between the frame and the mudguard. It should be the Poka-yoke washer on the drive side, pointing towards the inside, and a regular washer on the non-drive side. Finally, put the mudguards back on the axle and install the washer and nut on each side of the wheel. tighten the nuts firmly. Carefully connect the torque cable and motor cable in the correct orientation, using the arrows on the connectors as a guide. On recent Cowboy 3s, the orientation of the frame opening is slightly different. Make sure to properly align the axle with the cables towards the front of the bike. Place the belt back on the front sprocket and tighten it with a pin spanner. Use a 5mm Allen key to tighten the two bolts under the bottom bracket to 11 Nm. Check that the tension is correct with the Gates Carbon Drive app. You should measure the tension at least 3 times on 3 different pedal orientations. Tension should be between 45 and 60 Hz. On Cowboy 2, you can reinstall the belt by pushing it back on the front sprocket while turning the pedals slowly. Then check the tension with the Gates app and adjust it if needed.